Hey lady, welcome to the Grit, Growth, Grace podcast. If we haven't met, my name is Anne Marie. I'm wife to James and mom to 4 beautiful kids, plus 1 miscarried baby, from 9 months up to 8 years. My hope is to help other women experience the postpartum period all the way up through the first year of baby's life as a time of grit, growth, and grace. This is episode 2, a tale of 4 postpartum stories, part 1. My perspective on postpartum started long before I saw those 2 pink lines on the first positive pregnancy test. I'm one of 7 kids plus 1 miscarried sibling. And when I was growing up, both my mom and the mom of a family who were good friends of ours, also a large family, experienced postpartum depression. One of them had it every single pregnancy, but both of them, when they had it very severely. So my belief was that yes, I wanted to have a large family, but it was going to cost me quite a lot. I could not both be mentally and emotionally healthy and have a large family. It was going to cost me in a very significant way. And so as you can imagine, right, I was afraid of that. And I didn't really address it. The older I got, I didn't really question it. And I believed it was going to happen to me, not a matter of if, but when. And so as you can imagine, that doesn't really lead you to enter into pregnancy or the postpartum period in a relaxed sort of way. I approached it kind of like in Jack and the Giant Beanstalk, where you sort of tiptoe past the sleeping giant. Or kind of like you close your eyes in a scary movie, right? Hoping that whatever the bad thing is doesn't get you. But I believed there was really nothing that I could do about it, truthfully, nothing to avoid it, and it felt like something I had no control over. So when I went into labor with my son, I had sort of expectations of a very conventional experience. I was a nurse at that point, times a couple of years. And so I thought, I'm getting an epidural. Of course, this is the 21st century. Who wouldn't? And I got it and I was miserable. I remember distinctly them saying, it's going to take away the pain, but not the pressure. Well, the pressure got to me. It got to me pretty hard and I panicked. I told my husband, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go home. And I laugh a little bit now because, of course, I wasn't going home. I was in labor. I was about to have a baby. But I felt so out of control and like I needed to run away from that pain. So I thought, too, gosh, if it was this bad with an epidural, how much worse would it be without? And then the next question you have for yourself after that is, how am I going to do this multiple times to have my hopeful large family? But then the baby's born and you forget, right? Because it's such a beautiful experience. And that postpartum period, I was extraordinarily blessed. He slept pretty well, pretty quickly. He ate really well, pretty quickly. I had a full 12 weeks off of work. But then at that 12-week mark, I just launched right back into picking my life up pretty much exactly as it had been before he was born. When I got the 6-week, right out, blessing from the doctor to start working out again, I did. I went back to the hardcore workouts right away. Never even had heard of pelvic floor physical therapy at that point, so I certainly wasn't going to get an assessment or doing strengthening exercises or anything. I was right back into high intensity, high impact workouts. And yeah, in a lot of ways, any opportunities that were offered to me to slow down, rest, recover, or even just to make changes in my approach to my life, my schedule, my commitments, that is to say my overcommitments. I didn't take those opportunities. And truthfully, at that time, really, I didn't know better either. My husband encouraged me kindly multiple times to slow down, but I was not in a place to receive his word. When my son was 10 months old, we conceived my daughter, my second child, and that pregnancy pretty much from the start was rough. I had some significant personal stressors going on at that time, and then also I was being supplemented with progesterone, and my body did not react well to the supplementation. So towards the end of the first trimester, I made the decision to stop the supplementation because I just couldn't handle it. But I felt so guilty and torn and afraid because I was worried that I was going to miscarry, that without that supplementation, that I was going to lose the baby. And so this reinforced once again my fear that either the baby could be well or I could be well, but we couldn't have both. But the pregnancy continued. My daughter did just fine, and I was actually induced at 38 weeks and 3 days because she needed to have surgery. which she had when she was 2 days old. She went under general anesthesia, went on the breathing machine, she was intubated, and then she spent 5 days in the NICU after her birth, including over Christmas. And as I say it now, what a stressful thing, especially with my son who, at that point was 20 months old. But if you had asked me at the time, I would have said, yeah, I'm doing fine. I'm rolling with it. And I truly believed that up until right about 6 weeks postpartum, when I returned to part-time, not full-time work, but part-time work, and had my first panic attack in years. That marked the start of 3 really rough years. What I had feared most, as inevitable, was descending upon me slowly, and not going away on its own. And at first I thought, this is a hormone supplementation problem. There's something wrong with my hormones. I just need to be supplemented and then this is all going to go away. It's all going to get better. And that just wasn't the case. We got my hormones to a great point, and lab values looked good, but I was still really struggling mentally and emotionally. I tried Prozac for a short time and it flattened me out a little bit, my emotions, but didn't help anything, didn't make me better, certainly didn't get me back to feeling like myself. And so at a certain point I stopped that, but again, I didn't improve. Now at some point I was encouraged to try counseling, but I just rejected that outright because I thought that is for people who've had some significant trauma, something unthinkable happened to them. And that's just not the case in my life. So counseling isn't for me. And my daughter was born in December of 2017. In summer of 2020, things really came to a head. I had a come to Jesus experience. And after that, I did start counseling. And at the same time, I took a Catholic mindfulness course that was recommended to me by my therapist, and both made a really big difference for me. Counseling helped me to see how the coping mechanisms and patterns of behavior that had helped me earlier on in life and even to a certain point into adulthood were inadequate. And the mindfulness course was helpful to slow down what I call my hamster wheel brain, and then also just to kind of detox, I would say, from or rewire the negative symptoms, like the physical symptoms that I had of panic and how easy it was to just feel so out of control and anxious. Now, I went to counseling for a full year, but already by 3 months into it, I was feeling well enough that my husband and I were ready to try to conceive again. We had been avoiding pregnancy for several years with fertility awareness, specifically the Creighton method, because I had been feeling so rough. And so at that point, we were comfortable, both of us, to try again. We got pregnant on the very first month that we tried, and that was Gabriella. We lost her very early on in the first trimester, right around 6 weeks. And her postpartum story will be a separate one from this block of 4, because I think recovering from a miscarriage and postpartum with all of that is very different, especially because I was so early. It was not at all like recovering from a labor at full term. But the thing that is important for now to talk about is just that was the first experience I had of really letting other people love me. A whole community of people came together, our friends and family, to come to the funeral for Gabriella, first of all, but then also to check in on us, to send cards, to send flowers, which I love, to make meals for us, to help with our older children. And so that was really the first time that I had let people in, let people love us, and acknowledge that I was not, I did not have everything together, and that I needed other people and their tangible expressions of God's love for us. Looking back on that period, I actually perceived it as a gift and a grace, because we were so loved by the hands and feet of Christ through other people's actions during that time. About 3 months after we lost Gabriella, we conceived again. And at that time, we made a different plan for progesterone supplementation. And this time, the plan that we made was one that I was able to tolerate and was helpful for the baby. And so that was a shift in my thinking, I would say, especially thanks to counseling, to say, like, no, we need to pursue options for both myself and the baby that are helpful for both of us. And there's one thing I want to look back on from my pregnancy, well, from my labor experience with my daughter. So pregnancy 2, not Gabrielle the miscarriage, but pregnancy 2, my first daughter. And that is that I went in and told the nurse, I don't want an epidural. At least I want to delay one as long as I can because it was so rough. And the nurse, her name was Linda, and she had been a nurse for 32 or 33 years, and she was fabulous. And she said, no problem, Dolly. Well, then you're just going to have to, dance this baby out. And it was kind of a joke, but really she coached me. She coached me on movement and positioning and walking and all of these things that I had no familiarity with. And what it taught me was this. It taught me how to to start leaning into the pain and to see the pain of labor as purposeful. The pain encouraged me to get into different positions. And over time and later on after that labor, I learned that when you work with your body will assume the positions. And of course, you need some coaching too. But you will assume the positions that you need to get your baby to go through what are called the cardinal movements of labor. Head down, flexion, internal rotation, external rotation. And all of these movements the baby has to get through in order to come out. But from Linda, I learned that I could work with the baby and that the pain had a purpose. The pain had a purpose. And so, yes, everything that happened after that birth was really rough in terms of the next couple of years, but I did have that really good thing. I did not have an epidural. I had one shot of pain medicine with that birth with my daughter, but I did not have the epidural. And that was just something I hadn't even imagined was possible previous to that labor with her. And you might be thinking, Anne-Marie, are you telling me don't have an epidural? No, that's not exactly what I'm telling you. But what I am telling you is this. I do think that our labor and birth experience makes a big difference for our postpartum experience. And I mean that in two ways. The first way is that what our physical experience is makes a difference to our postpartum, right? And you can see that, right? If you tear, then you have a longer recovery or a certain kind of recovery, just physically what that feels like. But I also think that our mental and emotional experience of labor, including our mindset, our expectations, how we're treated, the kind of help and support that we receive, all of that makes a difference for our postpartum period, especially those first couple of months. And so that's why I'm sharing a little bit about each experience with you as I'm going along. Okay, so now we're back to my pregnancy with my second son. So I lost the baby, Gabriella, to miscarriage. I got pregnant again. And like I said, the progesterone supplementation plan that we worked out worked really well for both the baby and myself. And I was able to come off that even before the first trimester ended, actually. And so that pregnancy was the first pregnancy in which I really started to think specifically about postpartum long before it happened. We spend so much time preparing during pregnancy for labor, but I am now a firm believer that we need to spend at least as much, maybe more time preparing for postpartum because it lasts so much longer. And so I started to get intentional during that pregnancy with my son about thinking just in a very basic, rough way on a piece of notepad paper, who can help me and what can they help me with? Who can help me and what can they help me with? And I did that, early on in that pregnancy, but just starting to think strategically about how do I want this postpartum period to go? I had learned a lot over the last few years from January Donovan of the Women's School. In fact, the same summer that everything kind of came crashing down with the postpartum experience, I say that when she was 3 years old, but the summer of 2020 when things just really came to a head, that same summer I had heard in a virtual Catholic conference presentation, this woman whose talk was entitled, How to Create Maximum Impact When You Walk in a Room. I just thought, who is this? What is she talking about? But I was captivated. I was captivated by that idea. I want to have that kind of impact when I walk into a room. And so that was my first introduction to January Donovan. And I've listened to so much of her content since then. And there's so much in it that resonates deeply with me, my temperament, how I'm wired. And something that she talks about a lot is how life happens for you and not to you. And so when I was pregnant with my son, who is now 2 years old, I really started to lean into that concept. How can I be intentional about the type of growth that the postpartum period offers me? And rather than trying to bounce back at all, what if I'm being invited into something different than how I have been before? What if the postpartum period was a time for rest and recovery? Now, I was still really afraid as I had been previously about experiencing postpartum depression, but there were, I would say, cracks in the armor, chinks in the armor. I was starting to think on a little bit different lines. Is it absolutely inevitable that I have a really rough postpartum experience? Or is there any type of way that I could impact how that goes by the skills that I was learning and the mindset that I was starting to adopt, the shifts that were occurring in me? And even on a very practical level in terms of what I was reading and hearing, in addition to January Donovan stuff, I read The First 40 Days, that book, if you're familiar. And don't get me wrong, I'm not eating kimchi and sauerkraut and congee, however you pronounce that, these like warming foods as they were described, but from different cultures. I did not make any of those meals. That sounded kind of complicated, but the part that really stuck with me from that book, The First 40 Days, was this idea that you rest and you recover, and the natural hormonal shifts that the woman goes through after labor, right? When your progesterone tanks, your estrogen plummets, that those things are actually a feature and not a bug, like a feature of the system and not a bug. I had previously thought, oh my gosh, like this is why postpartum is just going to be horrendous for me because I'm having this major hormonal withdrawal. But a nurse practitioner was so gentle with me, even though I wasn't able to receive it when she first told it to me. And she said, Anne-Marie, every woman experiences this. And what I realized over time was that natural hormonal shift happens to everybody. It's not a sign of something going wrong, and it's an invitation. It's an invitation to slow down, to take a step back, to really look inward and focus on your family and your new baby. So from the First 40 Days book, and then others that I read like it, even Alyssa Vitti's In the Flow book, which had a whole postpartum section about postpartum exercise, nutrition, physical recovery, warming foods, which is just such a fascinating concept. I learned that you could really look at postpartum as its own specific time. So that brings us up through the start of labor with my son. So 2 pregnancies ago, my third labor, 4th baby. But I'm going to save that for part 2, which will be in episode 3. I'll talk to you then.